Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for an MP webinar on HR compliance and return to work, best practices and legal advice. I'm Amy Wieman, head of marketing here at MP, and we are thrilled to have an employment law expert here today from the renowned employment law firm of Jackson Lewis. Focused on labor and employment law since 1958, Jackson Lewis has 950 plus attorneys located in major cities nationwide who consistently identify and respond to new ways workplace law intersects business. Jackson Lewis helps employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions. The firm assists clients in cultivating high-functioning workforces that are engaged, stable, and diverse. They share their clients' goals to emphasize inclusivity and respect for the contribution of every employee. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company offering a suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help clients succeed by aligning their HR strategy with their business goals. Your presenter today is Sapna Jain, an associate in the Boston office of Jackson Lewis. Her practice focuses on representing employers in workplace law matters before federal, state, and state courts and administrative agencies. After graduating from Emory University School of Law, Sapna served as a research assistant for Professor Frank Alexander in his work for the Center for Community Progress relating to judicial receiverships, receivers' liens, and the tax foreclosure system in Shelby County, Tennessee. And just a short disclaimer, and while today's program is intended for educational purposes, it should not be construed as specific legal advice. And just a few notes, if you'd like to submit a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And also a recording of the webinar will be sent out later today, following the presentation along with the slides. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Sapna.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Sapna Jain. I am an associate in the Boston office of Jackson Lewis. And sort of going off that, if you have any specific questions at the end, my contact information will be sent out with these slides. So if there's questions that you want to talk about relating to your company, we can work through those together to find answers to all your employment needs. So today we're going to be talking about the transition back to the non-virtual office. There are a variety of topics and sort of the return to work umbrella, but we're going to focus on sort of these 4 issues that have started to come up more and more. So those include bringing employees back to the workspace, the COVID-19 safety measures that may be required when people come back to work, COVID-19 accommodation issues and things to sort of keep in mind. And lastly, vaccines and how to discuss and sort of have those conversations around vaccinations and vaccination cards and what may be the best course for you and your company. So a lot has changed in the time of COVID-19. People have adjusted to working from home for more than a year now. And so we'll talk about a variety of different things that employers need to keep in mind in terms of how policies are applied to limit exposure in terms of both legal liability and just general best practices. So as states are starting to lift restrictions, and more and more people return to work, it is a business decision on whether to require employees to return back to the workplace. a key part of this is the importance of maintaining flexibility. Think about what returning to the workplace looks like for different roles, and develop transition plans to bring employees back to work if you haven't already. In Massachusetts, we've seen restrictions be eased in the past few weeks. And so no matter where your employees are, you'll need to assess the COVID-19 cases in the city and state of the workplace. So for those of you who have clients across the country, that will mean juggling a variety of different restrictions, and those are things that Jackson Lewis is equipped to help with as we have offices across the country. So along with and then the next slide we're going to talk about is implementing these policies and practices to ensure the safe and lawful return to work. So you have a variety of COVID-19 related protocols which have been implemented throughout the last year. These include, screenings, medical inquiries, temperature checks, and you'll need to prepare and update existing policies to address new laws related to the use of leave and accommodation. So one example of this is the Massachusetts paid sick leave requirement that just came in to effect, I believe on May 28th of this year. So this area is constantly changing. So you need to be mindful of that. The other thing is to develop policies related to off-duty conduct, and it may also be updating policies. So this also includes standardizing your work from home policies. There may have been one that you had before, but it's probably a good time to take a look at that as people are starting to come back to work and have questions about, well, I worked at home for more than a year and my performance was great. Why can't I continue to do that? So the key here is to make sure that it's clear to your employees what the expectation is. And communication is key. Often where we see issues is where somebody thought, oh, well, that's not what I thought, that's not what was communicated to me. So make sure that the communication and the resources for employees are clear and accessible. And the other things, so some ideas and suggestions here are to impose appropriate limits on business travel, in-person meetings, and seating proximity. So this is for when you're in your offices. You need to train employees on the new policies and protocols and rules. Provide these resources, whether they're on an internal website portal, whether they go out hard copy, whether they go out in an email. It's never a bad idea to have employees read and acknowledge policies to make sure that they understand what they are agreeing to. Again, consider job description updates to reflect changes in job duties and essential job functions. So this includes, if somebody needs to come into work every day, understand why that is and make sure that the job description is clear and reflects that. And you'll need to consider how to adhere to regulations on changes in terms and conditions for employees on temporary visas. We've seen a significant increase in our immigration practice group focusing on how work from home policies have sort of adjusted and what that means for temporary visas or other individuals or other employees who have strict requirements relating to visas. And lastly, create business continuity plans. What does this mean going forward? What does this look like, and how have you adapted in the past year, and how can you continue to adapt and do both what's best for your work, what's best for your teams, and is in compliance with the law to avoid liability. On developing that return to work plan, consider reopening and other orders specific to your state and county. We've seen sort of a mishmash of things. At one point, Massachusetts had reopening notices, then Boston as a city had different ones, and some of the other areas have a variety of different restrictions. So you'll really need to look closely at that, or work with somebody who can help navigate those restrictions. You'll need to procure supplies and make workplace modifications required for safe operation. This may include having hand sanitizer stations more frequently throughout the office. It may include providing masks, if that's the case. And if you as an employer feel like you would like to keep these restrictions, private employers have the ability to do that, to ensure that that individuals are wearing masks when they come into the area, that they're doing temperature checks before they come in to keep the other employees safe. You'll want to identify individuals who will be brought back to work using a neutral selection criteria. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but you can bring people back in phases. But the important thing there is to make sure that it is a neutral selection criteria. And then you'll want to identify those who can continue to work remotely, and consider more formal telework plans. This is sort of in line with the return to work policies and updated job descriptions. You want to make it very clear what the expectations are. Again, sort of in this return to work plan, determine changes to exempt status, compensation, and schedule, such as staggered shift. This is an important one to avoid wage and hour issues, which can be incredibly costly. You really want to make sure that people are keeping track of their time. You'll want to consider work share and unemployment insurance implications, and determine updates that must be made to I-9 verification forms. You want to anticipate unique needs of various vulnerable employee populations. So that may be individuals who have disabilities, that may be pregnant individuals, and we'll talk about how to sort of plan for that, and also work and engage in the interactive process to ensure that you're engaging in the proper accommodation sort of requirements. And you want to notify employees of return to work with established dates, and if they were terminated, with rehire documents. Again, communication. When you have employees returning to work in phases, you'll want to take steps to articulate and document the legitimate non-discriminatory reasons why some individuals were permitted to return to work or work remotely, but not all of them. So to accomplish this, the focus should be on, positions and duties, not on the individuals who are in those roles. So the logic and rationale relates to the business judgment that employers have. And there are also additional considerations if vaccination is a condition of return. So we will talk about that. Vaccination, as you guys saw, were one of the topics. So we will definitely discuss the vaccination topic. So the next thing you want to do is address the remote work challenges. So if it's going to continue, make sure you have a plan in place for the employee's unique circumstances. And the companies need to get the job done. So, it may be time to sort of sit down and figure out, okay, what do we need? You want to set forth the expectations of the job. You'll want to do this in the job description, but then again, when somebody starts, you'll want to make clear what the expectations are. You want to talk to employees about performance issues that have arisen with any previous flexibility. If somebody has been continually absent on calls or meetings when they are working remotely, you'll want to address that with individuals. You'll want to address that with that employee, because in general, in terms of good communication and documentation, an employee shouldn't be surprised about performance issues. You'll want it to be something that they have been made aware of and that they can work to improve. So again, that communication comes in. So, and make clear that while you're willing to work with them, during this difficult time and want them to succeed, ultimately it requires effort on their part to ensure that the job gets done. So making those expectations clear and holding them to that through communication and guidance. Things to evaluate for work from home positions include, creating or modifying your policy. We've talked about that. You want to assess the viability of moving positions to work from home if they're not already. And making sure that you communicate and implement consistent messaging. And you want to have benchmarks for performance. That way, employees and their managers can be clear on what the expectations are and how an employee is doing based on a variety of different factors that they're aware of. And also keep employees connected. Employees, if they're working from home, you want to make sure that they are still involved, that they still feel like they're part of the company. Excuse me. Another thing that we've seen in terms of remote work is security risks and potential phishing attacks and breaches of confidential information. That's important to consider. Do you have employees using a VPN, a secure network to transfer files, to do their work on? The second point here, if non-exempt employers are working remotely, you want to make sure that systems are in place to properly record and track time. So those wage and hour issues, you want to avoid having those. You want to be aware of these potential evidence of the off-the-clock work, whether those are late night emails that are not generally when the employee is supposed to be working or plans on working. And then you'll want to make sure that your managers are trained on how to manage remotely. Um, it's easy to sort of go down the hall and have a conversation about, okay, here's what we're going to do today. But how do you encourage that and ensure that managers and the employees who report to them are able to sort of have those conversations and continue to do their work in this remote environment and succeed, not and thrive in those positions. So, like we talked about earlier, communicating with employees when there are issues and making clear, here's what's going on, here's how we can work together to improve that, and providing the employees with the tools to be able to do that. So, COVID-19 safety measures. We have seen a variety of different things and guidance that employers have had to juggle since all of this occurred in sort of the beginning of last year. And the guidance continues to come. So with your company, there's a variety of different things. There's the CDC guidance, the OSHA guidance, the recent EEOC guidance that just came out, the Department of Labor guidance, along with state and local laws. So all of those things are things that have to be considered. I want to take a minute just to talk about the EEOC guidance that recently came out. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, it clarified that it opines only on the legal implications under the federal discrimination laws and not, sort of on state laws or legality of other mandates. So keep in mind, this is for federal discrimination laws. But according to the EEOC, the federal equal employment opportunity laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees who are physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you want to keep the reasonable accommodation provisions in mind that are triggered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. But you want to note here, the EEOC is silent on whether employers can mandate the vaccine for remote workers. The EEOC guidance talks about people physically entering the workspace, but not the individuals who are working remotely. Employers can require the COVID-19 vaccine for all employees entering the workplace, but you have to meet certain requirements. And those two requirements are, the first is the qualification standard must be job related and consistent with a business necessity, so a business need. And then the second one is if a particular employee can't meet such the safety related qualification standard because of a disability or some other reason, the employer can't require that an employee comply unless it can demonstrate that individual would pose what's called a direct threat to the health or safety of the employee or others in the workplace. So it's not clear what's defined as a direct threat, which often happens in guidance, but this remains a controversial position, and some employers argue that a lower burden of proof applies. So again, this is recent guidance. We'll probably see other issues come up as we sort of go through this. The EEOC recommends that as a best practice, an employer introducing a COVID-19 vaccine policy and requiring documentation or other confirmation of vaccination should notify all employees that it will consider requests for reasonable accommodations based on disability or on an individualized basis. So again, that communication to employees and making clear that if there is something else, whether it's a disability or an individual request, that those need to be raised. So what do you need to do? So we have 3 basic rules, which is sanitize, stay home if sick or exposed, and mask and social distance. So what does that mean for employers? That means clean, screen, and mean it. So for cleaning, there are a variety of different things that have been implemented, but these include regular hand washing, again, placing hand sanitizers in high contact locations, cleaning merchandise before stocking if that's possible, and then daily disinfection of desks, workstations, work areas. And then if anybody's diagnosed with COVID-19, close and deep clean of those areas. And then you'll want to disinfect commonly touched surfaces. So in terms of practical considerations, you'll want to have signs around the office or work areas and at hand washing stations. And you'll want to address and speak with employees who don't practice good hygiene. One important thing here is to ask employees to think about their coworkers and what and why these steps are in place to make sure and be mindful of the health and safety of not only them but their coworkers. Scheduling disinfection of high touch areas throughout the day. So that's clean. Then we have screen. So what this sort of looks like in terms of practical consideration. So a daily symptom assessment. Now, whether that is on paper, whether that is through an app, or that may lead to potential assistance with contact tracing. Again, you want to be mindful of the other health information laws that are in this area. So limiting travel, contacting local health department if an employee is diagnosed with COVID-19. Now, these are as vaccination rates increase, there may be a decrease in these, but it's still important to note that you'll want to keep this in mind. And you'll want to think about policies and training. What training do you need to do around this? Is it just letting people know? Is it a calendar reminder every morning that if you come into the office, you need to get your temperature checked and fill out a certification that you do not have COVID-19? Another thing to think about here is reviewing current attendance and leave policies. So consider how disciplinary action for excessive tardiness or absenteeism may discourage employees from staying home if they're sick. You may want to allow for unpaid leave if necessary. Recognizing that doctor's notes may not always be readily available, and to train managers for proper implementation. So again, all of those things are important in thinking about how to approach the screen part of it. All right, so mean it, masks and social distancing. Depending on your business, you could be in for yet another significant change in cultural and personnel dynamics. We've seen this come up across the country. Consider face masks for employees or customers. Again, thinking about local and state orders. You'll want to think about potentially staggering lunch breaks and times, establishing maximum capacities. What is safe in your space? And postage on signage or around health safety guidelines in common areas. So important things to think about here, how does it tie into the company culture? Tie these things into your core value. You'll want to encourage employees to look out for each other's well-being, and sort of trying to find ways to sort of keep fun events alive in creative ways. For day-to-day considerations, scheduling calls or meetings online versus in person, or if you're going to do it in person, to see if you can maintain these 6 feet between individuals, or reconfiguring workspace to the extent that it may need to be reconfigured. So in this return to work, so let's think about preparing for common COVID-19 sort of related scenarios when people come back. So whether somebody's behaviors raise safety concerns, people who are capable but unwilling to work from home, employees who are asked to, or the opposite of that, employees who are asked to report to work but prefer to and are able to work from home. Here's one thing that we've seen is whether employers can discipline employees who refuse to return to the office. So generally, yes, employers can discipline employees who refuse to return to the office, but you have to keep in mind leave entitlements or potential reasonable accommodation requirements. And another thing to also consider is the HR and recruitment retention implications of all decisions. So you sort of have the legal side and then you have the practical side, which are considerations you have to look at. You should think about and understand the reason why an employee is unwilling to return to work. It may be a conversation with the employee about why they don't want to come. So, and based on that conversation, then you want to look at if it triggers a potential legal analysis. So this may relate to childcare obligations, continuing health concerns, and how those may relate to leave entitlements and accommodation obligations. And then other things that we've seen are, non-clinical fears or anxiety, or just general desires to avoid exposure to COVID-19 while commuting or working. These are not likely to trigger affirmative legal protections, and you can, you may be able to discipline those employees who fail to return to work. And the same goes for employees who just want to work from home. So those are things to sort of think about there. So we briefly talked about sort of accommodations, but we're going to dive into that a little bit more here. So with COVID-19 accommodation issues, there are a variety of different things to think about. So what COVID-19 related requests should you anticipate? So a variety of different things here. The government has advised I stay home because I fall into a vulnerable population category. I have been exposed to COVID-19. My spouse has, my child has. My child's daycare or school is closed and I need to take care of the child, or I need help with schoolwork. So think about training to proactively have managers be ready for these questions. when you're addressing these situations, you want managers and other individuals, including coworkers, to show empathy and be sensitive to individual employee situations. But along with doing that, you want to have them balance and be consistent in their approach, because that's key here, to be consistent in the approach. You will want to train managers on proper protocols. You'll want to discuss possible options with these individuals, such as moving workstations or staggering shifts, or allowing time off or reduced work schedule. So talking about the different ways to sort of address the concerns. And then most importantly, documenting these conversations and how situations are addressed. I can't tell you how many times we've had issues come up where, you know, Joe talked to Susie and they decided that this was going to be the situation and how they were going to approach it. And then you have Sapna and Josie talking on the other side and saying, okay, this is a similar situation. Now, you don't want the response to be different just because it was two different managers. You want to have a consistent approach. And so documenting those conversations, you know, not identifying individuals, but making sure that managers are clear in what that looks like across the board, so that the company can have an overall consistent approach. Within the accommodation sphere for the COVID-19 vaccines, so if employers are mandating the vaccine, which again, we'll get to that in just a minute, you'll have ADA implications, so the Americans with Disability Act implications. You'll have religious implications, and then you'll have GINA implications. So GINA relates to genetic information. And so again, the new EEOC guidance talked about this. It reminded employers that Title VII and the ADA, so the Title VII Act, may require an employer to provide a reasonable accommodation for employees who, because of a disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, you know, they may not get vaccinated for COVID-19. And so, you know, unless providing an accommodation would pose what's called an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. So again, it depends on the facts of the situation, but that undue hardship standard is one that you'll have to look at, and it depends on the operation of the employer's business. This means something very different for a small mom and pop company that may have 50 employees, and you know, that's very different than a large company that has offices across the country. So those are things to keep in mind. In addition, employees who are not vaccinated because of pregnancy may be entitled under Title VII to adjustments to keep working if the employer makes modifications or exceptions for other employees. So these modifications may be the same as the accommodations made for an employee based on disability or religion. So another thing to keep in mind when having those accommodation conversations. So in the guidance, there are some examples of reasonable accommodations. And so these include an unvaccinated employee entering the workplace. They might wear a face mask, or they might wear a mask. They may work at a social distance from coworkers or non-employees. They might work a modified shift, or they may be periodically tested for COVID-19. So these are all examples of reasonable accommodations. And the guidance also says, you know, this may be Reassignment may also be a reasonable accommodation depending on the situation. So you'll want to take a look at those and really look at what the specific issues are. Other potential issues and things to think about. So I want to touch on back to school plans and the impact of that on employees. So a variety of different laws to think about here. But the important thing here is you'll want to work with legal counsel to develop, communicate, and enforce a strong equal employment opportunity policy. If you don't already have one for your company, that's something you should definitely have, and we can assist you with that at Jackson Lewis. But you want to clearly address the types of conduct that might constitute caregiver discrimination for things like this. So when there's no policy or procedure, that's when you run into risk. And so if you sort of leave things up to managers to decide, that can create a lot of issues in terms of applying the laws. You want to train managers on gender stereotyping, which can violate Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So the Title VII that we were talking about. And other laws. And this is a key component of many caregiver lawsuits. So an example of this is when a manager applies a double standard, such as denying leave to a man who needs time off to care for a child because he has a wife, but giving a female that same amount of time off to care for a child. So you want to be mindful of that. You'll want to emphasize the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, during training. Given the complexity of the law, this is an area where we see an incredible amount of litigation. You want to make sure managers know they should talk to HR before answering any employee questions or making any decisions around an individual's FMLA leave. That is an area that can cause a significant amount of issues. You'll want to consider, hiring. We've seen more and more of this, of having unconscious bias training with employees to sort of help understand and avoid these issues. And the other thing is you want to avoid paternalistic policies regarding work and time off. Here, I can't stress this enough. Managers are not in a position to determine what a pregnant employee can and cannot do. That is not a determination for managers to make. So, and doing so may violate the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, Title VII, or other laws. So you want to watch out for these red flags. You want to make sure that individuals are aware of the issues here, and they know when to get HR or legal counsel involved to help guide them through these issues. All right, so the vaccine topic. This is a very hot topic as more and more individuals are becoming vaccinated and have their vaccine cards. So vaccines and returning to work. So the EEOC guidance on vaccines, we've talked about it a little bit. The EEOC clarified that as to incentives, they may be provided to encourage vaccination without running afoul of the EEOC's laws. But you have to make sure that the incentive is not tied to the employee receiving the vaccine from the employer or someone with whom the employer is contracting. So you want to make it very clear who is providing the vaccine. If the incentive is tied to a vaccine provided by the employer or its agent, then any incentive, which includes both rewards and penalties, must not be what's called so substantial as to be coercive. Now, what is coercive? That is not defined in the guidance. So we will see what ends up being coercive as things sort of play out. Excuse me. In terms of mandating vaccines, so employers contemplating vaccination mandates, you want to weigh a variety of different factors that go beyond sort of strict legal compliance. So there's sort of the legal answer, and then there's sort of a best practices answer. So you want to think about, are employees providing care for others who may not be able to be vaccinated? The amount of close contact necessary in the workplace, the risk of harm to others if employees are not vaccinated. One thing to think about here, how did the company fare during the height of the pandemic when there was no vaccine? If there were administrative controls used, during the pandemic, you may not need to incur the sort of legal and operational risks that come with mandating vaccines. The culture is always something to think about, and the impact on employee relations and disruption in the workplace if vaccines are mandated. So those are some areas. Potential resistance from employees, and the prospect of absenteeism following vaccinations because of adverse reactions, and potential need to pay employees for time spent receiving vaccinations. So these are a variety of different things to consider. So there are not only the legal, but the practical considerations against the underlying goals, which is driving that are driving a potential vaccination mandate. So no matter what you decide to do, whether you encourage or mandate vaccines, employers, you should be prepared with at least a policy framework and a communications plan as COVID-19 vaccines become more available. So again, communicating, understanding, and letting your employees know what that looks like. Can you ask employees if they have been vaccinated? Generally, yes, you can ask, but you want to keep in mind the vaccination records or the vaccination card may be subject to OSHA's 30-year record retention requirement. So that means OSHA has a records retention requirement, which says that medical records must be kept for 30 years. So do you, as an employer, want to keep your employees' medical vaccination cards for 30 years? What do the implications of that look like? So those are a variety of things to consider. Now, I also want to touch on the Massachusetts COVID-19 paid sick leave law that just came into effect about 2 weeks ago. Massachusetts established a statewide mandate for employers to temporarily provide employees up to 40 hours of COVID-19. It's called emergency paid sick leave. And so it relates to employees who are absent and unable to work due to a variety of reasons, including needing to self-isolate due to COVID-19, whether an individual has it or they're seeking care for symptoms for themselves or another family member. If there's a quarantine order, there are a variety of sort of other examples, but those are some of them. And sort of the highlights of this one are that all employers are required to provide this paid leave, but they may seek a reimbursement from the state for the amount paid to employees up to the $850 per week cap. So that's something to think about. And employees are entitled to use this paid leave from May 28th, 2021, so just a few weeks ago, to September 30th, 2021, or until the state says that the fund is depleted. So whichever comes first. So again, those are things to think about. If you have specific questions about the implementation of the paid sick leave law, the COVID-19 paid sick leave law, how that applies to your company, how to implement that, that is something that our team at Jackson Lewis is well equipped to do. And we have been putting out guidance in our newsletters and information in that. So that'll provide some additional information. And with that, I am going to the Q&A. So let me take a look at this. All right. So one of the questions that we have is whether employers can require employees to show their COVID vaccination cards when they return to work. So you can ask employees if they have been vaccinated, as we sort of talked about earlier, but you'll need to be mindful of medical retention requirements, of medical record retention requirements, such as the OSHA requirements. And it may be more problematic to sort of ask for vaccination cards. Another thing to think about here is minimizing the amount of employee information that you have to retain, because that can also help reduce potential legal exposure in the event of a breach. So when you're required to keep medical records for an extended period of time, more and more we've seen data breaches. So you want to avoid that and the liability that comes with that. So, ask yourself, is it really necessary for, our company's purpose to collect or maintain the data? Another way to sort of implement this is you can use less demanding vaccine policies, such as an honor code, to get a sense of whether employees have been vaccinated. The longer a company maintains a record, even if there's no sort of statutory retention restriction, so that's, legal restrictions, the longer you may be exposed to potential liability if the data is lost or stolen. One thing we've seen in terms of sort of honor codes is where employees are aware of other individuals who have not been vaccinated, but are not wearing a mask or not sort of abiding by the honor code. So again, you want to make that clear to the employees what the expectation is, and make clear what the ramifications are if someone signed an acknowledgement saying, or a daily certification saying, I don't have COVID-19 or I've gotten the vaccine or something like that, and how that's implemented. The implementation should be equal across the board, and you want to make sure that individuals are treated, or if they're disciplined, that they're disciplined in the same way, to avoid any sort of discrimination claims that may come up. Let's see. Another question we've seen are daily checks required now that New York reached the vaccination threshold. I will say I'm not a New York attorney, but we do have New York attorneys who can answer this, but the daily checks are still a best practice to sort of have a discussion around to ensure safety within the workplace. So we still have those in place, at least in our offices. But that will be something, whether it's statutory or required by the state, is changing. And I think I just saw a recent guidance that came out that New York is lifting a variety of its different restrictions. So I don't believe that they're required now, but it still is definitely a best practice. For the another question is, does the Massachusetts COVID-19 sick leave apply to leaves associated with side effects of the vaccination? This is a great question, and one that I believe it may be, but I will refer you to a resource that will give you the answer. Jackson Lewis online has a variety of different articles on new legislation or guidance or laws that have come into place. And so we have a full one on the COVID-19, the Massachusetts paid sick leave law, which really lays out all of the different things that it's required to cover. So I touched on a few of those, quarantine order, things like that. But you will want to take a look at that for the specifics, either that or the guidance set forth by the state. So with that, I thank you for your time. Again, if you have follow-up questions, my name is Sapna Jain with Jackson Lewis. My information will be sent out with the slides, and I would be happy to talk to any of you and go into more detail on questions you may have. And with that, I will turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you, Sapna. What a great program. Thank you all for attending the webinar today. We hope you came away with some helpful information around legal compliance returning to the workplace. I want to quickly remind everybody that a link to the recording will be sent out along with the copy of the presentation later this afternoon, and we'll also be sending out Sapna's contact information. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions on the webinar today, but you can reach out to her, and I'm sure she'll be able to point you in the right direction. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.